Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at Franklin Pierce's presidency, 1853 to 1857. It's a time often seen through this really heavy lens of personal tragedy, right? He just lost his son.
Yeah, it's impossible to ignore that personal sorrow. But our focus, really, for this deep dive is the huge national storm brewing during his term, the conflict over slavery, which was just intensifying rapidly and, well, shaping everything.
Exactly. And to help us understand this critical period, we've got two main sources we're digging into. First, a look at Pierce's domestic affairs from the Miller Center, and second, the actual text of the Kansas-Nebraska Act from the National Archives.
Right. So our mission today is sort of twofold. Understand how that escalating slavery conflict during Pierce's time really changed the nation's direction, and maybe see what lessons or echoes we can find.
Yeah, definitely. It's quite striking how his term began. The Miller Center paints this picture of a really bitterly cold inauguration day.
Almost symbolic, wasn't it?
It really was. And his speech apparently acknowledged his grief quite openly. His wife was understandably distraught, and they even canceled the inaugural ball.
Not exactly a celebratory start. It really sets a somber tone, especially for a presidency facing, well, enormous challenges from day one.
No kidding. And the difficulties just piled up early on. His cabinet picks were controversial right out of the gate.
Jefferson Davis as Secretary of War, that immediately put anti-slavery folks on edge.
Definitely. And the Miller Center points out his use of patronage, appointing loyalists, often with pretty strong views, kind of pushed aside the moderates in his own party pretty quickly.
And then on top of all that, his vice president, William Rufus King, died just weeks into the term.
So you've got a president dealing with intense personal grief, a party already showing cracks, no VP. It's a recipe for, well, a power vacuum almost.
Yeah, it perhaps left room for other issues, other agendas to really take center stage. Which brings us directly to the flashpoint of his presidency, the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Right. This hugely consequential piece of legislation. And interestingly, pushed by Senator Stephen Douglas, who wasn't exactly Pierce's political ally.
A rival, yeah.
To really get the impact here, we need to remember this background noise that had been building for decades, right? The whole issue of slavery in the territories as the U.S. expanded.
Absolutely. The Louisiana Purchase, land from Mexico.
Yeah.
It kept forcing the issue. Southern states were really focused on maintaining that balance in the Senate, free states versus slave states.
They saw it as crucial for protecting their interests.
Yeah.
And there had been attempts to manage this, like a Compromise of 1850 just a few years earlier.
A kind of temporary truce, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So now let's zoom in on Kansas and Nebraska. The Miller Center tells us these areas are mostly unsettled, but you had both pro-slavery groups and free soil advocates basically lining up ready to move in and claim them.
And the law on the books for this specific region was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That's key. It had banned slavery north of that 36-degree, 30-minute latitude line.
A line that had held for over 30 years. So why? Why would Stephen Douglas, a Democrat from the North, want to stir this all up again?
Well, the Miller Center suggests a couple of big drivers. One was his push for a transcontinental railroad. He wanted the route through Chicago.
Which would be massive for his political power and probably his wallet, too.
No doubt. But the Miller Center also suggests Douglas perhaps genuinely believed repealing the Missouri Compromise was necessary to keep the South on board, to keep the Union together, a calculation that badly backfired.
So his big idea was this concept of popular sovereignty.
Right. Let the people decide.
The National Archives document lays it out the idea that the actual white residents in Kansas and Nebraska should vote on whether to allow slavery or not.
Now, here's a twist. Pierce's initial instinct, according to the Miller Center, wasn't actually popular sovereignty. He apparently leaned towards letting the Supreme Court decide.
Interesting. Why?
His thinking, it seems, was that the court might rule the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional anyway, which would kind of take the heat off him in Congress, especially from the North.
A political maneuver, maybe.
Yeah.
But it didn't play out like that.
No. The Miller Center describes how Douglas, Southern Senators Jefferson Davis, they put immense pressure on Pierce.
And he eventually agreed to explicitly repeal the Missouri Compromise, that 36-degree, 30-minute line restriction.
Yeah. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passes in May 1854. Pierce signs it. And the consequences were immediate and explosive.
Absolutely huge. The Miller Center really stresses this. The Whig Party basically disintegrated because of it.
It just fell apart.
And rising from the ashes almost instantly is the Republican Party. Their whole platform built on opposing slavery's expansion. And soon enough, Lincoln's leading them.
And the Democrats weren't spared either. The Miller Center notes they were deeply split. Northern Democrats like Douglas and Pierce himself saw their support up north just plummet.
That's ironic, isn't it? This act was supposed to settle the slavery controversy, make it a local issue.
But it did the exact opposite. The National Archives source is clear. It reopened the national struggle over slavery and just poured fuel on the fire. Tensions went through the roof.
A massive miscalculation of the national mood.
Totally. And instead of peaceful local decisions, popular sovereignty turned Kansas into, well, a literal battlefield. Pro-slavery, anti-slavery settlers rushed in, determined to win that vote.
Which leads us straight into Bleeding Kansas. That name says it all, really. The Miller Center describes it vividly, this territory becoming ground zero for the national fight over slavery.
You had these pro-slavery groups, the Border Ruffians, as they were called, coming over from Missouri, the Miller Center says, specifically to intimidate people and, frankly, stuff the ballot boxes.
And at the same time, abolitionist groups were sending in their own people, arms sometimes included, to counter them.
So a pro-slavery government gets set up, and it asks for federal backing. But the territorial governor, Pierce, had appointed Andrew Reeder, seemed more aligned with the anti-slavery folks, who were likely the actual majority of residents.
And Pierce's move here is crucial. According to the Miller Center, he sided with the pro-slavery faction. Apparently, his dislike of abolitionists was pretty strong.
Right, so he dismisses Governor Reeder, appoints Wilson Shannon, who is much more sympathetic to the pro-slavery side.
Predictably, this just enraged the Free Soil settlers. The Miller Center says they basically tried to set up their own unofficial government in defiance. It was a powder keg.
And it blew up. The Miller Center recounts the violence in May 1856. First, pro-slavery forces sack the anti-slavery town of Lawrence.
Looting, burning.
Yeah. And then, just days later, retaliation. John Brown and his followers brutally murder 5 pro-slavery men near Pottawatomie Creek.
Just horrific violence on both sides. And Pierce. The Miller Center notes he was slow, reluctant even, to send in federal troops to try and stop the fighting.
It really highlights a kind of paralysis, doesn't it? The situation in Kansas, this whole slavery debate, it just consumed his presidency, according to the Miller Center.
Yeah, it overshadowed everything else he might have wanted to do. And the public perception grew that he was just indecisive, ineffective in handling the biggest crisis facing the country.
It's a tough legacy. A reminder, maybe, that not confronting these huge moral and political divides head-on can be disastrous.
Definitely. And the Miller Center mentions he actually wanted a second term, maybe to fix things. But his own party, the Democrats, had had enough. They dropped him for James Buchanan in 1856.
Let's maybe look a bit closer at the actual act itself, based on the National Archives document. The title sounds so bland, right? An act to organize the territories of Nebraska and Kansas.
Yeah, it gives no hint of the firestorm it was about to ignite.
But the core of it, as the Archives reiterates, was that repeal of the Missouri Compromise, getting rid of that 3630 minutes line restriction in the Louisiana Purchase lands. That was the explosive part.
That's what opened the door to fighting over slavery out west again.
And the Archives confirms Douglas introduced it in January 54, proposing the 2 territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and pushing that popular sovereignty idea.
Let the settlers decide. But the Archives really underscores the outrage this caused, because both territories were north of that line where slavery had been banned for over 30 years.
It flew in the face of established compromise. The Archives mentions the months of really bitter debate before it finally passed in May 54.
And we've talked about the immediate result, that chaotic rush into Kansas. Pro-slavery, anti-slavery, both trying to stack the deck for the first elections on slavery.
Directly causing the violence, the Bleeding Kansas situation, as the Archives reminds us, it wasn't just political maneuvering anymore, it was actual bloodshed.
And the National Archives points out just how much deeper this drove the wedge between North and South, made reconciliation seem almost impossible.
Yeah, the path towards peaceful resolution seemed to be vanishing.
It's also really important, and the Archives highlights this, how opposition to this specific act fueled the rise of the Republican Party.
Absolutely. That became their rallying cry. No expansion of slavery into the territories.
So the bottom line from the Archives is pretty stark. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a major accelerant, pushing the country much, much closer to civil war.
No question about it. Looking at the details in the act, the Archives shows it laid out the whole structure for these new territories, territorial governments for both Nebraska and Kansas.
And it explicitly gave them the power, the right, to decide on slavery when they eventually applied for statehood. That was popular sovereignty in action.
It set up the usual branches, governor, legislature, courts, like the archives details, a whole system.
And voting rights, initially. The act specified free white males, over 21. But it also said that territorial legislatures could set future rules. Though, interestingly, the archives notes military personnel couldn't vote.
Right, and the powers of those legislatures were laid out, but always, subject to the U.S. Constitution and the Act itself, as the archive states. Appointments of officials like the governor came from the president with Senate approval. Standard procedure.
Each territory also got a delegate in the U.S. House. Non-voting, but still a voice, according to the archives.
Mm-hmm. And importantly, the archives points out that U.S. federal laws applied there, except for that crucial Missouri Compromise slavery restriction. That was specifically nullified.
There were also provisions for setting aside land for schools, sections 16 and 36, in each township, the archive says. That was pretty standard practice.
A common thing, yeah. And the archives mentions Fort Leavenworth being named the temporary capital for Kansas. Just a practical starting point.
And finally, the act did include language saying existing treaties with Native American tribes in those areas would be respected.
Which is another whole layer of complexity and westward expansion, of course.
So wrapping this up, Pierce's presidency, shadowed as it was by his personal loss, really becomes this cautionary tale, doesn't it? About what happens when fundamental divisions aren't faced, when leadership perhaps falters in a crisis.
It really does. The choices made then, especially around Kansas-Nebraska, had such devastating long-term consequences for the country's unity. It makes you think about the weight of those decisions, especially when dealing with issues that are so deeply divisive and morally charged.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And, thinking about that intense polarization, the struggle over basic rights that just exploded into violence in bleeding Kansas, it kind of makes you pause and consider how those dynamics, those kinds of fundamental societal conflicts, might persist or echo even today. Something to definitely keep thinking about.